Today we have another fabulous speaker and a perfectly appropriate one to send you all home feeling really good. Relaxed, a little exhausted, but good. Today's speaker, Shawn Achor, will tell us about the huge difference that happiness can make in each of our lives, and that if we're trying to work harder to be happy, we have it wrong. So I've got to remember that. In fact, we have it exactly backwards. Shawn, a New York Times best-selling author, an international consultant, and the world's leading expert on happiness says, here's how to get to health. We need to reverse the formula for happiness and success. We need to be happy before we can be successful. So join me, please, in warmly welcoming Shawn Achor to the NatCon 17. Thank you.
Hi, well, good morning, everyone. I'm so thrilled and honored to have this opportunity to get to come speak with you here today. This is an absolute thrill, partly because when I first got into doing this research in the first place, when I first went off to college, my father was buoyed by the idea that someday I might come back and I might be a doctor or a lawyer or a banker, something he thought would make a lot of sense. And when I came home from college and told him, Dad, I want to study the science of happiness, he sat me down. My father is a neuroscientist at Baylor University down in Waco, Texas, and he told me that the average scientific paper, the average scientific journal article is only read on average by 7 people total, which is incredibly depressing for a researcher to hear, especially because I know that that statistic also includes my mom. So now we're down to 6 people who read these studies, which is a travesty because, as you know, we've been finding ways to actually transform what it means to be human by realizing we don't just have to be our genes and our environment, but by making small positive changes to the way that we view the world, the daily habits we have, we could actually make huge implications, not only for our health outcomes, but for our educational outcomes and our business outcomes as well. What I want to do today is to share the research with you that I think validates your existence and the work that you're doing, and to buoy you as you go back home as well, but also to show us how much happiness could actually remain a choice even when times are difficult. So 3 years ago, my son was born. I have a little 3-year-old, which makes sense, and he was born. He was born in February, and my wife said I was traveling too much doing this work, and I was. So she said, you can't go anywhere in February unless Oprah calls. 3 days later, Oprah called. I was like, that's amazing, say somebody else also. And then because of some complications happened 3 days after Leo was born and my wife was out of the hospital, I was in the backyard of Oprah's house in Montecito, California, talking about happiness. It was the craziest week I had ever had. I'd never met a celebrity at this point. I thought I'd be cool. I was not. She had a big redwood forest on her property, as one does, and you have to walk through it. And then you get to the base of it, they want to film this beautiful and organic meeting with Oprah for the very first time. So they have camera crews going, and I walked through this, and I saw her for the first time, and my brain just turned off. And she was like, Shawn, 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 and I didn't know the protocol, Oprah, Oprah, Oprah. And she had her hands up, so I grabbed them, but then I didn't know if we were doing a handshake. We literally turned all the way around before they shut off the cameras. It's the only time they've ever had to redo it. But 5 minutes later, she makes you feel so comfortable, you feel like you could tell her anything, like you're the most important person in the world when it's actually probably her. And so that's why this next part happened, but you'll hear why I wanted to share this morning is because there I am, amazing week. My only child's born. I'm there at Oprah's house talking about happiness research, and as they were breaking down the cameras after this hour, talking about how happiness leads to success, I turned to her and said, I feel disappointed, because I really wanted to talk about how I went through depression back when I was at Harvard, because I said, it's so easy for people to hear this research and be like, well, of course he's happy. He's a happiness researcher. He's married to a happiness researcher, right? And of course, Oprah's happy with all her opportunities and resources and wealth. It's got to be easy to be happy if you're Oprah. She turned to me and she said, I went through 2 years of depression when I was at the height of my career, making the most money, when Beloved didn't do as well as I wanted it to, and I just shattered. And I turned to her, I told her, I went through 2 years of depression while I was at Harvard, teaching Harvard students how not to become depressed. She turned back on the cameras. We did a whole second hour that was so much deeper than the first hour, talking about how happiness remains a choice even when it doesn't seem like it's a choice anymore. I remember at the time writing in a journal saying, I don't remember feeling happy, and I don't think I ever will again. I never expected that someday I would be on the stage talking to you here today about happiness, but I think that it's important. And I think that while happiness is a loaded word, I think it's exactly where we need to go here today. Before we get into any of that, I just want to get you all on the same wavelength about how I got into this research in the first place. So I want to start where I started my TED Talk, and then I'll deviate from there. But I started all this academic research when I was just 7 years old. So if any of you have children and they're 7 and they're not doing academic research, you're clearly not pushing them hard enough. But when I was 7 and my sister was 5 years old, I was 2 years older than my sister at the time. We were playing up on, and I'm 2 years older than her now. But at the time, that meant she had to do everything I wanted to do, and I wanted to play war. I'm from Texas, so on one side of the bunk bed, I had all my G.I. Joe soldiers and weaponry lined up, and on my sister's side, she had all of her My Little Ponies and unicorns lined up for this cavalry charge. And I wasn't too concerned about what was going to happen. I had won this war every single time we'd played in the past. And if I was losing, the rules of engagement would change. But there are differing accounts of what happened that afternoon, but since my sister was not invited to come speak with you here today, you're going to hear the true story. Which is my sister is a little bit on the clumsy side, and somehow, without any help or push from her loving older brother at all, suddenly Amy disappeared off of the top of the bunk bed and landed with this crash on the floor. And I nervously peered over the side of the bed to see what had befallen my fallen sister, and saw that she landed painfully on her hands and knees on all fours on the ground. And I was nervous because my parents had charged me with making sure that Amy and I played as safely and as quietly as possible. And seeing as how I had accidentally broken Amy's arm just 1 week before this. Don't take her side, you don't know her. But I was trying as hard as I could to be on my best behavior, and I saw in my sister's face this wail of pain and suffering and surprise, threatening to erupt from her mouth and threatening to wake my parents from the long winter's nap for which they had just settled. So I did the only thing that my little frantic 7-year-old brain could think to do to avert this tragedy. If you have children, you've seen this hundreds of times before. I said, Amy, wait, please, please, please don't cry. Did you see how you landed? No human lands on all fours like that. She stopped mid-cry with confusion on her face and looked up at me, and I had no idea where else I was going. That was the extent of the strategy. So I blurted out the only other thing I could think of, which is, Amy, I think this means you're a unicorn. Which was cheating, because there's nothing in the world Amy would have wanted more in that moment to not be Amy, the hurt 5-year-old little sister, but Amy, the special unicorn. Of course, an option that was open to her brain at no point in the past. And you could see on my poor, manipulated sister's face conflict as her brain attempted to devote resources to feeling the pain and suffering and surprise she'd experienced falling off of a bunk bed or contemplating this newfound identity as a unicorn on the other side. And the latter won out. Instead of crying, instead of ceasing our play, instead of waking my parents with all the negative consequences that were about to ensue for me, instead a smile spread across her face and she bounded right back up onto the bunk bed with all the grace of a baby unicorn. With one broken leg. But what we'd stumbled across at that tender age of 5 and 7, we had no idea at the time, was something that was going to be the vanguard of a scientific revolution you're leading right now. That we don't just have to be our genes and our environment, but that we can make small positive changes into people's lives, and it not only ripples to them, but it actually ripples out to the people around them, allowing optimism to be something that's not just an inherited skill set, but something that could actually be learned and taught as well. And when that optimism arises, what we've been finding in this research is every single educational outcome we know how to test for rises dramatically. Every single business outcome and ways of finding jobs rise dramatically when the human brain is positive. And many of our health outcomes are correlated with the optimistic mindset as well. What we're interested in then is how do we actually create that type of conversation with the world? So, when I first got into doing this research, my very first talk outside of academia was out to a large Swiss bank at the beginning of the banking crisis, and they didn't realize how disgruntled the senior leaders were, and this guy introduced me. He said, well, we don't have bonuses for everyone, but here's a talk on happiness from a guy from America. You can imagine the cold response, but as soon as we got into and the Swiss bankers, but as soon as you got into this the research side of it, they started realizing that there are ways you can actually restart forward progress in the midst of the challenges we're experiencing. Since that time period, the conversations change. When I go out into organizations, I'm not going out having to argue that having a positive mindset or treating your employees is valuable anymore. They're saying, we get it. We know that that's a huge implication about how our students are doing in classrooms, how our employees are doing within the workforce. The question is, how do we actually create that? And is happiness even the right word? Happiness is a very loaded word, and that's the reason I wanted I chose it, because I think that it starts a very difficult but wonderful conversation. So I got started back at the Divinity School before doing this. I was studying Christian and Buddhist ethics at Harvard Divinity School, looking at how our belief systems change the way we decide to act in the world. While I was there, I realized that the ancient Greeks defined happiness extraordinarily differently than we do in 2017. Their definition of our definition is happiness is pleasure. So if I'm not smiling right now, I know something's wrong. Or work isn't fun, I know that this isn't the right job for me. Or I'm clearly not feeling happiness within my life right now. The ancient Greeks defined happiness not as pleasure, which is so short-lived, it's not worth us talking about here today. They talk about happiness as the joy you feel moving towards your potential. That potential is as a human being, as a lover, as a parent, as a brother, as a sister, as an altruist, as a poet, as a musician. The joy you feel moving you towards your potential is valuable for two reasons. First of all, joy is something you can experience even when life isn't pleasurable. Go for a long run, your legs might be burning, but you can still feel joy in the midst of that displeasure, as you see what the human body is capable of. Worked 8 to 9 months trying to help out a community. You're going to have long hours, high levels of stress, but you can still feel joy as you watch your strengths emerge, or you saw people on your team actually bond together, or you see the ripples effects of positive changes you've been able to make despite the bureaucracy or changes to the political or economic landscape. I'm told even in the midst of childbirth, not high levels of pleasure all the time, but moments of joy that could actually correspond with it as well. The other side of it is I think we're afraid of happiness as a society. I think we've actually become more afraid of happiness as a society recently because we think if I'm too happy right now, maybe I won't solve some of the problems I need to fix within this world and I'll become complacent. Maybe we won't solve some of the inequality and the discrimination we see within the system. Or maybe if I'm too happy right now, I won't be as hungry to make positive change within the world. Or if my kids are too happy, they're going to slack off in school and not get into a good school. That's what pleasure does. Joy does the exact opposite of the human brain. Joy, as you watch positive change emerge, actually turns on the human brain to its highest possible level. It triples your creativity, dramatically improves your productive energy, allows you to deeply connect to other people, allows us to dramatically improve our problem-solving abilities, and it raises every single business and educational outcome we know how to test for. If we're trying to make these positive changes within a community without being positive ourselves, we're hamstringing our brain's potential to be able to do that. The question is, how do we create happiness in the midst of the challenges we see in the world right now and that we're experiencing within our own lives or the things we've been going with in our own lives? Last year, I was out speaking in Northern California to CEOs of top software companies, all CEOs of these incredible companies. And afterwards, one of the CEOs offered to drive me to the airport to talk about how we could cascade this research out throughout his global company. And I was so excited. Got into this guy's really nice sports car. I don't even know what it was. The doors went up instead of out. I got in, put the door back down, put on my seatbelt. He got in the other side, immediately started talking to me about how his company had been growing so quickly over the past 3 years. His stress levels have been skyrocketing. And as he was speeding towards the airport and weaving all over the roads, and I'm holding on for dear life, that little bell was going off on his car, the seatbelt bell. And eventually it stopped going off. It got tired. And I turned to him. I said, "I'm sorry, but you don't wear seatbelts?" He said, "No, Shawn, I listened to your talk. I love your research. I'm an optimist." I was like, oh no. No, you're an idiot. But I'd love to work with you, sir. Optimism is great for a lot of things. It doesn't stop cars from hitting us. It doesn't stop reality from impinging upon us. That's irrational optimism. And if you sugarcoat the present, we make poor decisions for the future. If we sugarcoat the present, people stop believing in your leadership and advice. If you come back from this conference with irrational optimism, all the pessimists in your world are going to continually put the negative right in front of you to try and move you back to reality. That's not what we need. And what I've heard so far at the conference, I think the underlying reason you're here is not irrational optimism. It's rational optimism. You start not with rose-colored glasses. You start with a realistic assessment of the present, the good and the bad that's going on currently in the present environment, the strengths and weaknesses we have as individuals or the people that we see around us. But in the midst of the realism, you maintain the belief that our behavior matters if linked to the right people. which to me is exactly the reason you're here, exactly the reason you do your work. That in the midst of the challenges you see realistically, you maintain the belief that eventually our behavior will matter if linked to the right people. When we have that type of approach, we see something remarkable emerge from the data, which we see people that don't avoid the negative, they're actually able to deal with the negative in a way that's so much more powerful than sticking our heads in the sand. And what we found is the research I'm about to get to share with you. One other thing, I just wanted to add this in. Last night on Twitter, I saw somebody, I don't know who it was, but they posted and they said something about positivity. Positivity means that you're trying to ignore the hurt you're going through, which just allows the abusers to abuse you more. That's not what positivity is. Positivity isn't about ignoring the hurt you're having. Positivity is saying that in the midst of the pain you're feeling, that this is not the end of the story. Positivity says in the midst of the hurt and pain, we can actually make a difference still eventually, and we can turn even pain into something that causes us to create positive change within the future. Positivity isn't ignore the negative, it's about creating more positive in the world around us. And when we have that type of understanding about what positivity is, we see incredible changes occur worldwide. If anyone needs to not be afraid of happiness and positivity and optimism, it's you. We need you. We desperately need you to maintain your optimism because you are the line between us and going into a more negative world. We desperately, desperately need you. And the research we've been doing actually relates directly to it. So I study in a field called positive psychology. I learned under Dr. Martin Seligman, and my mentor is Dr. Tal Shahar at Harvard, who started the happiness course there. We study, when we look at data, we don't just look at the average. What we're trying to do is learn and figure out who the positive outliers are within the data so we can actually figure out why they've risen above the curve. So we look at schools to see why they're in a school in Dallas or Chicago with low socioeconomics, all the academic scores seem to be depressed, yet 4 or 5 of the students, their scores are rising. In addition to studying the average and the people that are lagging behind, we also study those outliers to figure out what it is that's causing them to do that. Because I believe that as we study the positive side of the curve, in addition to depression disorder, it allows us to move the average, not people back. It allows us to move people not just back up to average, but how to move the entire average up in our companies and our schools worldwide. But the reason that I focus so much on this research is because this is not the message our brains normally receive as you try to create positive change in the world, or the people you work with try to create positive change. Because as you turn on your smartphone and find out what's going on in the world around you, your brain is immediately bombarded by negative information. Murder, corruption, diseases, natural disasters, chemical bombings, political infighting, and very quickly your brain starts to think, that's the accurate ratio of negative to positive. We can talk about happiness for a little bit here this morning. We can talk about being positive around like-minded people, but as soon as we leave here, let's get back to reality. Reality is mostly suffering, and if I'm not suffering now, it's coming. That's the message our brains receive as we process the world. And what it's doing, as you know, is it's creating what we call the medical school syndrome, which is you read through a list of all the symptoms and diseases that could happen to a human being. Suddenly, these brilliant and aspiring medical providers start realizing they have all of those symptoms and diseases now. You'll sometimes start manifesting the symptoms you were studying for an exam. I have a brother-in-law named Bobo, which is a whole other story they didn't give me time to talk about here today. Bobo married Amy the unicorn and became a pediatrician. So this is perfect. So Dr. Bobo called me on the phone from Yale Medical School, which is our rival, and he said, Shawn, I have leprosy, which even at Yale is extraordinarily rare, but I had no idea how to console poor Bobo because he had just gone over an entire week of menopause. See, what we're finding is it's not necessarily the reality that shapes us. It's the lens through which we view the world that changes how we process it. I have to tell you one thing I forgot, but I think it's really cool on this last part. So my wife and my wife was a national network news anchor. She went from El Paso to Chicago to New York in 3 years becoming a news anchor, and then she quit her job at CBS in New York because she felt like she was telling negative stories over and over again, and she felt like that if I wouldn't want a kid walking through the room while I was doing this work. So she went back to the University of Pennsylvania to study positive psychology, and that's how we met, and we do this research together. We just did a study with Ariana Huffington, and we found that if you watch 3 minutes of negative news in the morning, just a 3-minute introduction of negative news in the morning, as opposed to positive news, it turns out that people in the negative category, we know we're actually going to be a little bit more negative. But it turns out 6 to 8 hours later, when we retested them again, they had a 27% higher likelihood of reporting a negative day compared to the group that saw the positive news. But we can't just tell positive news, so we went back in to test it, and we found that if you say the same piece of negative news, but you append a solution to it, turns out you don't get those mood impacts, but your creativity on the next task rises by 23%, which is amazing. Our problem solving rises even in the midst of problems if we have a solution. But if we just see broken bridges and that's all we see, our brains don't actually move forward, and we start to believe that that's what the world is like. What I believe is happening here as we do this is we need to change the way that we process the world, and we need to start realizing that we actually have an impact upon other people and the way that they process it as well, which is the heart of the work you do. But in order to show you some of that impact, what I'd love to do is to do a brief experiment with you right now. You don't have to do any of my experiments today. I'm not allowed to bring consent forms to talks anymore after the electric shock problem we had a couple times ago. But if you're willing to participate, all I need you to do is to please partner up with someone that you're sitting next to. Please partner up into pairs of two. Of course, partner up into pairs. The only caveat is I'm legally required to tell you that you cannot partner up with someone that you're married to for this experiment or that you wish you were married to. So move around if that's a problem here at the conference. So partner up very quickly. It's okay if one person asks to watch. It's sometimes more fun to watch. So here's what I need you to do. The person sitting closest to the exits over here, which some of you might already be eyeing, you're person number 1 in the group. The person furthest from that wall, you're person number 2 in the group. So there should be a 1 and a 2 in each group. If you're equidistant from that wall, you're front to back, the person closest to stage is person number 1. If neither of those apply, you can pick one person to be number 1. So raise your hand if you're person number 1 for this experiment. Raise your hand if you're person number 2. Okay, that's not the experiment. I have to do this now because I did this experiment on Wall Street a few months ago, and it literally took that bank 5 minutes to figure out who number 1 in the group was, which explains their leadership problem. So here's what's interesting. How many of you, by the way, are psychology friends? You read, you have a psychology degree. I know there's a lot of you here in this room. So for my psychology friends, this is the emotional prime of the experiment. And for everyone else, this is nothing. Over the course of your life, you've taken your genetic predispositions, your genes, and you've built those genes up through your self-discipline and your self-control. You're able to pass the classes you needed to in school to get into the jobs you wanted to apply yourself to your work. What I'd like you to do is use all that self-discipline and control that you've been cultivating for decades, and I'd like you to use it to control your behavior for just 7 seconds with your partner if you can. At 8 seconds, you could do whatever you like, to or with your partner, but for 7 seconds, we need you to control yourself. So person number 1, what we ask you to do in this experiment, is to not get angry with person number 2 when they do to you what I'm about to tell them to do to you. Person number 1, don't get angry, don't get sad. Please, please don't cry like the group a couple weeks ago. That was so embarrassing. That was at the Pentagon. So here's what I need you to do. I basically need you to do nothing with your partner. So person number 1 and 2, please turn and face one another. Person number 1, make sure you're within striking distance of person number 2. And person number 1, don't move your hands from this point in the experiment, even to defend yourself from person number 2. I see some of you taking off your glasses. That's a great idea. And person number 1, just go neutral on the inside. Try to feel no emotions and try and think no thoughts, which at this point in the conference should be very easy for you. So person number 1, once you're ready, using your decades of self-discipline and control to control your thoughts, your emotions, and your face, showing 0 emotion on your face. And person number 2, please look at them. Make sure you're looking at them directly in the eyes. And for the next 7 seconds, person number 2, please smile genuinely and warmly, but directly up into the eyes of person number 1, while looking at them as warmly and as deeply as possible. Ready, go. And stop. So I'm sorry. We're going to need to do that one more time. I didn't realize that person number 2, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were the one with all the power and the control in this relationship. So let's just switch it around. Now, my few psychology friends know you never repeat a psychology experiment with deception in it, but let's just try it. Person number 2, go neutral on the inside. Feel no emotions, think no thoughts, control your face with your decades of self-discipline and control. Person number 2, please look at them. Or person number 1, please look at them. Make sure you're looking them directly in the eyes. And for the next 7 seconds, it's your turn for retaliation. Please smile genuinely and warmly directly into the eyes while looking at them as warmly and deeply as possible. Go. And stop. My favorite part about this experiment, my favorite part by far is as soon as I say stop, everyone in the room relaxes as if that was a difficult task to do. Some of you are like, I did it. You did nothing for 7 seconds. Failure in this experiment, failure meant you smiled when I asked you not to. Success meant that you did not smile for the full 7 seconds. Raise your hand if you failed miserably in this experiment by smiling when you were not supposed to be smiling. Look around the room, incredibly high. Raise your hand if you successfully did what I asked you to for the full 7 seconds you did not smile. We don't have time to count all the liars, but here's what we found. I've done this experiment now in 51 countries across the globe. 80 to 85% of people worldwide cannot control themselves for the 7 seconds of this experiment. I've done this with senior level bankers, all men, all in their mid-50s in Tokyo, Japan, smile percentages in the mid-70s. Extraordinarily universal. I have to tell you one other thing, because I know this is a well-traveled audience. I just think this is amazing. So I've done this in 51 countries. One of them, I made a mistake. You're going to figure out the mistake before I made it, but I have to include it in here. So 2 years ago, I was invited by a royal family in a Middle Eastern country to give a talk there to 300 women in the Middle East about how to raise up levels of positive leadership amongst women there. And some of you know the mistake I made. I was so excited about this opportunity, I wasn't thinking about it. And I started my talk actually with this experiment, and halfway through realized that 90% of the room was veiled for the smiling experiment. Which had I thought of before, I would not have made that cultural mistake. But I'm so grateful I did, because the women in the room taught me something. They told me that the experiment still worked. They could see the smile in the other woman's eyes. And behind the veil, the smile was equally contagious. What I love about this is I'm talking about the science side here today, but if you're listening for it, there's something so much deeper, something so much more human going on here that the science is only scratching at. But from the science side, you put me into an fMRI brain scan my brain while I'm smiling, small portions of my brain will show activation basically saying, Shawn, you're smiling, which we knew would happen, I'm smiling. But if I stop smiling, but you keep scanning and you flash an image of one of you smiling in front of me, small portions of my brain in the mirror systems can start to activate. And when those mirror neurons or mirror systems start to activate, they can say, Shawn, you're smiling. But I'm not smiling, you're smiling. But before I can stop myself, my brain drops a neurochemical most of you know called dopamine into my system, raising my levels of happiness and enjoyment and causing my face to contort into a smile before I can stop myself. You might have seen these mirror systems here this morning if you were looking at your partner while you were smiling at them and their lips were quivering while they're trying not to smile. That's weird, that shouldn't be happening. What's happening there is their mirror systems are fighting against the motor systems. The brain already thinks it's smiling. It's like, what's the problem here, face? You've seen these before. If you've ever had to speak at a conference and one person starts to yawn and then other people start to yawn, that's not because you're boring. That can't possibly be it. I keep telling myself. What's happening there is as I see people in my visual field start to yawn, my mirror neurons or my mirror systems can start to tell me I'm the one that's yawning, and I can pick up the fatigue response of someone sitting across the room. Where this gets fascinating, especially for the work that you're attempting to do in this world, is that if you have 15 strangers all waiting for a plane, they don't even know they're part of an experiment. They're just waiting at their gate for their plane. You introduce an undercover researcher, stand in the middle of the 15 people in a 5-meter radius. Undercover researcher just begins to bounce nervously in place. Tap his foot impatiently on the ground, and look at his watch repeatedly with a frown on his face. Within 2 minutes of waiting for that plane, depending on the study worldwide, on average, 7 to 12 of the 15 individuals will unconsciously start shifting nervously in place and or tapping their foot on the ground and or looking at their watch more than 4 times in a 2-minute span of time. If you don't believe me, this is one of the experiments you can try out yourself the next time you get on a plane, if you want to spread stress and negativity to the people on your plane. Which is why I always do this one at a different gate. But the reason... No one laughs at that joke. You guys are amazing. That's my favorite joke. Now I don't even know what to do. Wasn't expecting. Now I have to start over. When I was 7, no. What I love about this experiment is because it shows us not only do smiles and yawns spread, but it turns out negativity, stress, uncertainty, and anxiety we can pick up like secondhand smoke. You don't even have to be the one smoking to have the negative health implications. The same thing is true with how other people's brains process your world. Now, as soon as I start to tell people, which, by the way, I've seen over and over again in changes that have been occurring in the political and economic landscape, almost every dinner I have with my friends devolves into all this conversation about all the negative that's going on and the problems we feel and the stresses we feel, and it starts to spread even to my little 3-year-old who's sitting there listening to us talk about it as well. What we've been finding in the midst of that is that if we leave that believing that our behavior doesn't matter, we leave paralyzed in the midst of that situation. What we need to do is exactly why you're here, which is to be activated. What we've been looking for are there ways... I think all this research that we're starting to see actually shows us we were studying you wrong. As I look at you now, there's no organic material connecting us in this society, in our country, in our world. There's no wires connecting any of our brains, so we study you as individuals. Here's your depression. Here's your engagement score. Here's your intelligence and memory and strengths, and all of that's true, but it misses out on the most important thing. As you know, it misses out on how beautiful the human organism actually is. We're not wired together, but our brains are designed to be wirelessly connected through these mirror systems. It's the biological underpinnings of why you do what you're doing. It's compassion and sympathy and understanding that connect us so that others' emotions we're not immune to them, we're actually connected to them, which means we don't process the world, we actually co-process the world with other people. It's why when we create selfish forms of happiness, it keeps slipping through our fingers, because it turns out that happiness and meaning and engagement and optimism, those aren't individual traits, they're interconnected traits. And when we study them at the individual level, we make a huge misunderstanding about how we actually interact with others. But what it also means is, in the midst of challenge and stress, where many people are talking about only the negative, or it's so easy to see the challenges and threats, that if you insert a few positive changes into a conversation, into somebody's daily habits, into the way they interact with other people, we actually watch not only their optimism levels rise and the happiness benefits we were going to talk about in a second, but you actually watch, using big data now, we can actually watch as the brains around them start to tip towards the belief that change is possible for them, or that happiness is a choice 2 or 3 degrees of separation from the initial person who made those positive changes. What we got excited is maybe there was actually a ripple effect that was going on that gives us hope that oftentimes we don't get to see. We've seen this over and over again. I only have time for one. The reason I'm going fast is we're trying to cut it down just a little bit so we get you out on time. But I have to tell you one example, and I think this is amazing. Post-Hurricane Katrina, after Hurricane Katrina, I got the opportunity to work at a group of hospitals down in Louisiana. Hospitals have a very difficult time, right? As you know, you go in, their customers are their patients feel sick, or you just surrounded them with people that are sick. But how do you solve that? It's a hospital, that's what you're supposed to do. So what they decided to do is they went out to see what the Ritz-Carlton was doing to raise people's levels of customer satisfaction there. One of the things they found is that they train all of their employees to do something called the 10-5 way, which is if you walk within 10 feet of an employee at the Ritz-Carlton, they're trained to make eye contact and smile at you. Within 5 feet, they're trained to say hello. It's actually really fun to go in and out of those spheres with them. Even if you're not staying there, what we did was we imported that idea down to the group of hospitals. We trained 11,000 doctors, nurses, and staff to do the simple 10-5 way experiment. Now, those of you who've been trying to create positive change, you know you get pushback sometimes. Some of the doctors said, you hired me to save people's lives. I make you a ton of money. Don't tell me how to walk them down the hallway. I'm not doing the stupid smiling initiative from HR. We said, you don't have to, and this isn't coming from HR, but this is an opt-in program. You can choose whatever you like to do. But we surrounded them with 11,000 people who have opted into the program, and we're socialized to reciprocate. So if you get into an elevator with somebody and they say hello to you, you don't slam up against the side of the elevator. Most of the time, you usually say hello back and then pull out your phone. What we've been finding, that's what was happening in the hospital hallways. Doctors, nurses, and staff were doing this. None of this is interesting. The patients haven't been impacted yet. As they walk in the hospital, the patients, they never learned the 10-5 way. They didn't go through one of our trainings. It's not posted anywhere. It's not part of their mission statement. But as they walk into that building, their brains unconsciously learn the new social script. Within the space, I'm licensed to give eye contact and smile to other people and treat them as if they're human beings. And what we watch, as you videotape and observe them, not only do they reciprocate, we actually watch them initiate a social script they never consciously learned. Now, that'd be a cute story about how you can change hospital hallways. The reason why we got involved with the project is to see how that impacted the quality of care 6 months later. 6 months later, the group of hospitals that adopted this versus the one we kept as a control group, group of hospitals that adopted this in Louisiana had a significant rise in the number of unique patient visits to the hospital. The likelihood of patients to refer that hospital based upon the quality of care that they received skyrocketed. That's their most important metric of the hospital. And the doctors' engagement levels were the highest in a decade. What's amazing about that, that's a 1-second free behavioral change that resulted not only in more people cared for, better quality of care, or at least the perception of it, and greater levels of engagement by the people that were providing it. What I got interested in is, what if we had more than 1 second? What if you get more than 1 second with a patient, or more than 1 second with a client, or more than 1 second with a family member? Could you take somebody with a negative external world and turn them into a rational optimist in the midst of it? You know you can, but most people actually think you can't change other people. But we change people there's literally no scientific basis for that at all. Almost every single scientific study where you have an intervention at the human level shows that you're making a change upon them. Those of you who study psychology, you know I just switch around questions, I can change your response to things. We're changing people all the time. The question is how long we can sustain it. What we're looking for is, could we actually help people who maybe even have genes for pessimism or depression turn into rational optimists in the midst of the challenges they're experiencing? That's the research I want to get to share with you now that undergirds the work that you're doing if you're not aware of it already. As part of this research I got to do back at Harvard. I grew up in Waco, Texas, lived there for 18 years. When it came time for college, we didn't have money for college, which was fine. I could have stayed in Waco for free. I applied to Harvard on a dare, but I wasn't valedictorian in my public high school. I didn't get perfect SAT scores. I was a volunteer firefighter there, and it's something about what happened in Waco, and that story got me in, but then we couldn't afford it. 3 weeks later, I got a Navy ROTC scholarship that paid for the whole thing. And suddenly, something that wasn't even a possibility because of the military became an opportunity. Reason why I tell you that is listen how it flips the research that I was looking at later on. Because when I arrived on campus, I found myself in classrooms full of people that I know were much smarter than me, were better academically prepared than me, and I could have felt bad about myself, but I remember sitting there thinking what I felt like when I was backstage, which is I can't believe I get the privilege of being surrounded by all these incredible people. There was future poets and philosophers and engineers. They were all talking about Facebook, but it was amazing. You could see on their faces the ones who saw their education as a privilege instead of as an expectation. Those of you who are parents know exactly what I'm talking about. When you see your education as a privilege, you take classes you might get a bad grade in just because you want to learn. You ride the bench for 4 years in a sport you're terrible at because you want to make friends. Those are the students that love their time there. Even though they didn't get the highest grades, they're the ones who give the most in alumni donations back to Harvard in the end, which is why Harvard got interested in happiness in the first place. But then I spent the next 8 years of my life teaching and researching there because I felt like if I left, they're not letting me back in. So I just stayed. I lived in the dorms with the freshmen for 8 years after graduating. My mom was so proud. But in exchange for room and board, what they give you is 30 freshmen. You live in the dorms with them. You eat all your meals on trays in the dining hall with them, and you counsel them during their first year of being there at Harvard. And what I realized was after doing this for 3 or 4 years, there's a pattern. After 4 weeks of being at the school, no matter how happy they were last year, it turns out 4 weeks into the school, their brains are not focused on the privilege of being there, nor fully focused on their philosophy or physics. Their brains become scattered, thinking about the competition, the workload, the stresses, the hassles, the complaints, which should have created great levels of happiness, right? Wasn't. 80% of Harvard students report going through work debilitating depression at some time during their 4 years. The stat that we heard earlier today is that 1 out of 5 people go through some sort of medical issue or a mental issue within their life or dealing with that. 80% of the Harvard students in a 4-year period of time are reporting going through depression. The last time this was public, 10% of the Harvard populace reported contemplating suicide over the previous year. That was a study that was done by the University Health Services of 2,000 of the 6,000 undergraduates. Now, things have started to change there, but what I started to do is I started to travel and doing this research, and now that I've been to 50 countries doing this, I realized that story had nothing to do with Harvard, had nothing to do with privileged Ivy League students in America. The story has to do with every single human brain in the world as we contemplate the connection between our previous experiences, how much happiness we think we're worthy of in the present, and what we think is going to happen in our near future. When my friends from Waco come to visit me, the very first thing I do is I walk them in the freshman dining hall at Harvard, which has these vaulted wooden ceilings, Tiffany stained glass along the sides. This is their cafeteria. They walk in there and they roll their eyes and say, this looks like something out of Hogwarts from the movie Harry Potter. It does. This is Hogwarts from the movie Harry Potter. And this is Harvard. And they see this and they say, why would you waste time studying happiness at Harvard? Why aren't you in the slums of Venezuela, or an impoverished school in Africa, or in a children's cancer ward? Then we'll talk about whether or not happiness is a choice for people. Since then, I've researched in all of those places. Last year, 2 years ago, I got to work with St. Jude Children's Hospital, learning from some of the doctors there why it is that 4-year-old children with terminal cancer are more likely to tell their parents everything's going to be okay instead of the reverse. Why is there access to resilience in childhood that we lose in adulthood, and how do we import that to soldiers coming back from combat services? That's not what we get to talk about here today, but something I care passionately about. If you're interested in that, I did a documentary with HBO 2 years ago called State of Play, Happiness. And in State of Play, we looked at how do you talk about things like happiness and optimism in places where people think that they're too tough or have been through too much to be talking about that. So we went in for that show to the NFL and to the U.S. Navy SEALs who have gone through combat. And for the first half of it, we looked at the NFL because it would be helpful for the documentary, but also because these are people that, their average career is 3 years on average, high levels of CTE, high levels of injury. They're not allowed to talk about going through pain. And 3 years later, 50% of them are bankrupt. In the midst of that, we talked about, can you talk about happiness while you're trying to be competitive? But the second half of it is the part I want to tell you about. Second half of it, I sat down on a table with Michael Strahan, with Marcus Luttrell, the lone survivor, the Navy SEAL who went through who fought in Afghanistan, who went through hell and came back, and then Peter Berg, who directed Friday Night Lights. And we had a conversation about how do we change the conversation so we could talk about happiness and optimism. To be honest, I was so intimidated. First of all, Michael Strahan is huge in real life. He has these big broken fingers from football. He was holding an iPhone Plus, and looked like a nano in his hand, and he's tackled people in the Super Bowl. And then Marcus Luttrell, 6'6", also all muscle. He's been in combat multiple times. And then I'm like, and Harvard students are depressed too. So I was trying to be tough. I was trying to be as tough as I possibly could. And I was like, we shouldn't be using words like happiness probably, right, guys? We should be using words like grit and resilience. And they said, absolutely, we need to talk about that. And they shut it down, the idea that we shouldn't be talking about happiness, because of course we want grit and resilience. But even as Angela Duckworth talks about, that's only one dimension of human experience. If all we had was grit and resilience, we might eliminate the negative effect upon us, but we've never got to positive. You can have all the grit and resilience you want and never possibly get to a meaningful interaction with other people, or meaning in your social relationship, or joy in the work that you're doing as you're trying to make a better world for other people. When we say we want our kids to be happy, when the people we work with know that they want happiness for their kids, what they're doing is shorthand. They want grit and resilience for their kids. They also want optimism and meaning and social connection, and change the way that they view stress within the world. And if we could create that, we could actually sustain something that's so much more real and so much more long-term than pleasure actually is. The work that I do now, which I'm going to skip over right now, is basically I go into organizations, mostly with companies, but I'm also working now a lot with the schools because we've had some really cool things go on, but trying to convince them about why they need to actually focus upon positive changes within inside their organization, why happiness should actually be a crucial strategic focus of the company, because and then I have to explain it based upon the business outcomes that they use. But the business outcomes and the quantitative side is just to get them to focus on the things that they should be caring about in the first place, which are actually building up the people that are working with them. What we found is only 25% of job success is predicted based upon your intelligence and technical skills. 75% of it are based upon these other three dimensions. Then we found if we prime kids to become more positive at age 4, leave other ones with neutral instructions, kids at positive, put blocks into shapes 66% faster than children in the neutral category. Why? Why would happiness affect spatial memory? But then we found doctors, you prime them to become positive, they're 19% faster and accurate in coming up with the correct diagnosis. That should have been healthcare industry transforming, but only 7 people read these studies. Then we started putting it together. We found and this is where I'm going to shorten it, every single business and educational outcome we know how to test for rises dramatically when the human brain is positive, all of them. The question is, how do we change? So I'll skip to that. But one thing I have to tell you, so I did work at a large insurance company. We did a 2-day positive psychology intervention with them, tracked them for 18 months, so revenues increased by 50%. Now the entire company is shifting to this idea, which was great, but the COO there said we need to get this into our schools. So we took the parable that I wrote off of the Happiness Advantage, a parable that I've written for kids, which is about this orange frog. The frog's green, has an orange spot. Every time it does something positive, it becomes more orange, but it hates that because it makes it different from everyone else. But then it realizes being orange is contagious and then advantageous and starts to affect these other pawns. He took that into the poorest school district in Iowa, the poorest county in Iowa, and gave it to all the people that lived within that community, which is incredible. So Joel Pedersen was the superintendent there, and he said when we study schools, we get it wrong. We think about the teachers and administrators when we train them, but really when a child thinks about school, they think about the teacher and the librarian and the lunch staff and the bus driver. So we did trainings for all of them. We did the 10 5-way training for the lunch staff, so they're giving out mashed potatoes and positive reinforcement at the same time. The bus drivers wrote a 2-minute positive handwritten note to each of the students on their bus by name and with the strength that they felt like that student had that they had picked up by driving them each day. That goes home to the parents. It turns out the bus drivers were the front-facing part of the communities. We've been doing these positive changes now with them for a 2-year period of time, and what we found is their ACT scores have risen from 17 to 21 on average composite score. They were in the bottom 10% of schools according to the Obama administration. Now they have a 95% attendance rate, and for the first time in Iowa history, they have open enrollment, so you can send your kids anywhere, and kids from the richer counties are actually coming to the poorest county in Iowa so they can get a better education. They just passed amazing. They just passed a $5.3 million bond because they were so proud of their community in the poorest county of Iowa because they wanted to see where this positive change could actually occur. What I love about this is this doesn't just work at the Harvards or the elite private schools or the Googles and the Facebooks. We're now doing it at the school in Kentucky that has one of the worst illiteracy rates in the country. We're doing this in places that have the highest rates of abuse next to a Native American reservation. We've been seeing how these positive changes can actually create positive changes within our life, and it's giving us hope. But I think it's based upon 2 things. A mindset change that we need and a behavioral change that we all need. The mindset changes. We have to stop thinking that as soon as we solve all these problems, then we can start talking about happiness. Work harder, be more successful. As soon as we achieve these problems, think how happy we'll be. I did some work at the White House, and I was so excited about getting to talk there. And 10 minutes in, somebody raised their hand and said, I'm sorry, I can't talk about happiness at work. I'm on the Atrocities Commission. I can't come into work talking about happiness every day in the midst of the atrocities we see go on. But then she kept talking. She said 2 of the members on her team had actually attempted suicide. She can't keep people on her team long enough because they keep burning out. And when she goes to the pool at the end of the day with her daughter, she feels guilty when she feels happy, knowing what other women in the world are experiencing. What we forget oftentimes is that belief that our behavior matters, that meaning we see in our relationships, and those moments of success in the midst of a challenging world, those are the only things that fuel us to keep going when things get difficult. And what they needed most was the part that they had cut out of their life because they thought that they created happiness anxiety. I can't feel happiness. I'd feel guilty about that when other people are feeling negative in the world, when what the negative people in the world desperately need is for us to be positive enough that we could actually start to tip over and be able to spill that out into their lives by creating positive change, which is exactly what you do. The other side of it is, so thank you for the work thank you. The other part is how do we create change, and how do we actually sustain it? So I know you had Vivek Murthy, the U.S. Surgeon General, come in and speak. He's one of my favorite people in the entire world. I think he's absolutely phenomenal. I will vote for him for anything, literally anything. So I got to meet up. Well, I'll tell you about that in a second. So I think this is the deepest part of the talk. This next part. How many people play this video game? A lot of you. It's okay if you haven't. You're more productive than the rest of us. What we found is, if you play Tetris for 5 hours in a row, you actually start, one of the students that we were doing this at Harvard, she went up to the professor 3 weeks later, grabbed this old professor, turned around, she said, Professor, I think you're going to think I'm crazy. After that experiment where you made me play that game for 5 hours sitting in the basement of that laboratory, I walked out of the experiment, met up with one of my friends, and we walked into the supermarket, and she found me rearranging the bread on the shelves to make straight lines. She said, am I crazy? He said, yes, you are. Please stop touching me. But it turns out, She wasn't. What she was experiencing, people were dreaming about Tetris. Has anyone here dreamed about Tetris? We usually get a couple of people who have dreamed about Tetris. I've had the same experience, but with different games. What we found is if you view the world the same pattern for Vice City, but if you play the game for too long, what happens is your brain starts to keep those patterns even if they're maladaptive. That's the part I think is important. Sometimes we view the world through a pattern for too long, we retain that pattern even if it's maladaptive for us. You've all seen it, but I was working with a large accounting firm, working with KPMG, working with their tax auditors, trying to make tax auditors happier. And one of the tax auditors they work for 8 to 14 hours a day, reading through tax forms, looking for mistakes and errors, which make them great at their job. They get promoted, levels of happiness drop. I came in to work with them. One of the guys in the control group came up to me and said, over the past 3 years, I've been getting about 20% less work done. I just don't find meaning in my work anymore. I'm struggling to find happiness in my life. I said, I'm so sorry you're experiencing this. What have you done to fix it? And he said, I've tried everything. One day at lunch, I decided to sit down at my desk. I didn't go eat. I just sat there, and I made an Excel spreadsheet. I was like, I don't think that's going to help you. You should be eating. And he said, no, I realized that this was impacting me at home. So I needed to open up a dialogue with my wife. So I made a list of all the things I wanted to talk to my wife about. I made a spreadsheet of all the mistakes I felt like my wife had been making in our relationship over the past 6 months. So we could work on it together. I printed it out. I even prioritized it for her. Printed out the spreadsheet, brought it home to my ex-wife, handed this to her. He told the story word for word like that. And what I realized was this is not a bad person. Here's someone who got stuck. He trained his brain to look for the mistakes and errors, which made him great at one part of his job. But then he never compartmentalized that skill set, just like that woman who worked for the Atrocities Commission. And as a result of it, she never scanned for the successes that she had, or he looked for the meaning involved for the relationships he had as a tax auditor, or the successes he had for his clients, or the strengths he was getting to use. So when he became a leader, a tax audit manager, all he could see were the flaws and the mistakes and errors on his team, nothing to praise or recognize. When he came home, he was treating his wife and his son like a tax form. If I could get through these flaws and blemishes, man, then I could really love them. What happens is, if we view the world looking for all the threats constantly, if we're constantly focused on the negative, as we do conservative risk analysis, as we open up our inboxes looking for the fires we need to put out, as we watch the news, tell me about the bad stuff again and again. I don't need to hear about the positive, it's already good. Just tell me about what's going on right now in politics. And what happens is, as your brain does that, your brain becomes an expert, as you know, at scanning the world for the negative. The problem is it's stealing resources for the part of your brain that actually would scan the world for the things that you're grateful for, the meaning involved within our life, and the ways we can move forward in the future. What we need to be able to do is to be able to find a way to build that up, because that same work that you've been doing for more than a decade, sometimes that same work or that spouse you've had for more than a decade, sometimes as you start to do this, you stop to be able to lose the ability to process the positive. So you get an eclipse of that same work. You get an eclipse of the world. It seems like a darker, more dangerous place. You get an eclipse of your spouse. And as a result of that, we miss out on so much of the meaning that fuels us to make this a better world. We can build it back up, and we can do it based upon, to connect the dots with what we were doing with the U.S. Surgeon General. In January, Vivek Murthy, Dr. Murthy, invited me to come to DC to meet with a couple people to talk about how we could actually create emotional well-being as a core focus of what the work that they're doing within the government, which I think is a fantastic idea. What we were trying to impress upon him, and he was already on board with this based upon one of the talks he did at the Aspen Institute, is that we have, in terms of global habits, one habit. We get people to brush their teeth. After that, it's a huge drop-off. There's nothing, right? A few people get a flu shot. That's it. And what we found is, what if we could add in one other 2-minute positive habit that would actually half the amounts of depression that have doubled over the past decade, find a way to dramatically improve every educational outcome in our schools, and dramatically improve our optimism and limits the challenges we were having. We can do that habit even while we're brushing our teeth. What we were looking for, what are 2-minute habits that take less than 2 minutes a day, that if you did them for just a period of 21 days to 6 months, we could actually change the default around which somebody fluctuated, even if they had chronic levels of depression. We found 4 of them and a 5th one that took more than 2 minutes. This is your work, so I'm just going to zoom right through them, but I just wanted to mention them because as we're struggling, as we're going back, it's one thing to say, I choose to be positive, I choose to be happy, but it doesn't work. Mindset changes without behavioral changes never hold, right? And the flip doesn't work either. That's why dieting oftentimes fails. So Emmons and McCullough found if for 21 days in a row, we got you to think of 3 new things you're grateful for that occurred over the past 24 hours, 3 new things, have to be new each day, and you repeat it for 21 days in a row. Even the homeless populations we've been working with who say, I can't think of anything I'm grateful for, 21 days later, they have 63 unique, sometimes small things that they're grateful for, and not just the what of gratitude, which is important, the why. If I say I'm grateful for my son, Leo, that doesn't work. If I say I'm grateful for my son, he gave me a hug yesterday, which means I'm loved regardless after this talk today, that works. Do it for 21 days in a row. The value of this isn't the robust list. The value is, as I scan the world, I go back to looking for threats in my world, but my brain devotes a few resources to scanning in the background, like a background app, scanning for the positive that's going on. You suddenly start to see a few more positive pinpricks in the midst of your day. And what we find is people who are testing as low-level pessimists over and over again, which is why we think there might be genetic predispositions for that. 21 days later, they're testing as low-level optimists on average. That shouldn't be happening. That's a genetic trait, right? You're born a pessimist, you die a pessimist, that's the end of the story. That's not the story at all. That's not the story. We found a 45-second disruptor that changes the default around which you fluctuate. Columbia found if you do it for 6 months, the pattern actually continues to rise to low to moderate level of optimism. 4-year-old children around a dinner table, you have them, if they seem to be predisposed towards pessimism, you have them think of 3 new things they're grateful for. Do this 6 months later, before and after school, they're testing on average as low-level optimists, which is life-changing. The reason I'm mentioning this is to give us hope again, because it's not only our genes and environment, which are important, but those start the story. That's not the end of the story. What we're now finding is a 45-second change to your day could actually overcome the impact of our genes and environment over some of the things that we've seen in the worst parts of the world in terms of the environment, and despite having a starting place of genes that might predispose you towards chronic levels of depression or pessimism. The other 4 are quick. 2 minutes. This is one of the ones that got me out of depression. I remember sitting on a floor at Harvard, So here's what you have people do, because I'm out of time. So what we have people do is you think of one positive experience every day for 21 days in a row, a single positive experience, and then you bullet point 3 details you can remember about that positive experience. It's easy enough that somebody could pick it up. It takes less than 2 minutes. You can do it on a Starbucks or Seattle's best coffee napkin. And what we found is if you do this for 21 days in a row, so you think of an experience, and you write down where you were, what you were thinking about, what you said, then you could throw the napkin away. The reason it's valuable, you just stamped one of your memories as meaningful, and your brain can't tell the difference between visualization and actual experience, or much difference. So your brain just doubled the most meaningful experience of the past 24 hours. Do it for 21 days in a row, your brain is a pattern maker. It connects the dots. We did this with the National MS Society. People with chronic neuromuscular disease, previous research found if you do positive expressive writing like this for 6 weeks in a row, 6 months later, they were able to drop their pain medication by 50% on average. These sound like tips or tricks, cute takeaways at the end of a talk, at the end of a conference. These are literally the building blocks of how we not only deviate from our genes and environment to create an inflection point, but allow us to sustain the positive changes we need in order to solve the problems we see within this world. Final 3 are quick. 15 minutes of fun, mindful cardio activity is the equivalent of taking an antidepressant a day, as many of you know, but with a 30% lower relapse 6 months later, no, 2 years later. That's for the first 6 months. For the next 2 years, 30% lower relapse rate. Not a repudiation of antidepressants. It's an indication of why exercise is valuable. It's a gateway drug. When people exercise, they start realizing that their behavior matters, and they create entire constellations of positive habits. Meditation, I've been doing that out of Google. We make it as easy as possible. You take your hands off your keyboard for 2 minutes a day, watch your breath go in and out. Go from multitasking to single tasking, right back to multitasking. Their accuracy rates improved by 10%, stress levels dropped dramatically, levels of happiness rose, engagement scores rose. At Google, and they have endless swimming machines, and they have micro kitchens every 450 feet, but Google's head of people operations, Laszlo Bock, told me that 4 weeks after being at Google, people start complaining that the line for free sushi on Fridays is too long. Or how am I supposed to work here? The toilet seat's not heated. And what happens is, as people see this, the external world doesn't work for long. It's the belief that your behavior matters, and it's the mindfulness trainings that we've been able to do that creates that positive change. The final thing is the most powerful, and I would love to see this community do this, because it shows us how powerful we actually are. For 21 days in a row, you think of a new person each day, and you write them a 2-minute positive email or text, praising them or thanking them for strength. That's it. A 2-minute positive email each day, praising them or thanking them for one thing. I wrote to a high school English teacher one day. I said, "You're the reason I fell in love with reading. You're the reason I wrote a book. Thank you for changing my life." Took me 45 seconds to type. Took me longer to find that woman's email address online. When you leave here, you're gonna pull out your smartphone very quickly. I know you will. As soon as you do, you listen to all this research, write a 2-minute text message praising or thanking one person in your favorites list. Try it. If you do it for the next 3 days in a row as you go home, turns out if you do it for 3 days, your brain literally gets addicted to it, because you spend all day long thinking about how amazing you were for writing that email in the morning. You're like, I'm the kind of person who does this stuff. And you get great emails back because they don't know about this 2-minute maximum rule, so they write about how great they think you are. You're like, tell me more. We should hang out more. But 21 days later, if we all came back here to Seattle, which would be amazing, I think we should do this. 21 days from now, we all came back here, and magically you all did this habit for the next 21 days in a row. Turns out if we tested you on social connection, your score would be in the top quartile. The reason I want to conclude there is we found if there's a secret to happiness in the science side of it, the greatest predictor of long-term happiness is your social connection score. The breadth, depth, and meaning in your social relationship. It overcomes every single thing else we have within this field. And this is what we gave to the U.S. Surgeon Journal. Social connection, we now know, is as predictive of how long you will end up living as obesity, high blood pressure, or smoking. You know how hard we need to fight against the negative in this world, but we sometimes forget to tell people how powerful the positive could be. And if we got people to do a 2-minute positive habit, we can extend their life as much by getting them to stop smoking. But get them to do that positive habit, they start to see their behavior matters, and their likelihood of stopping smoking rises dramatically. Likelihood of losing weight rises dramatically as we see that our behavior matters, and we can see those constellations of impacts. Amy the Unicorn, since I sped through a lot of this research, if you're interested, if you email start@happinessadvantage.com, start@happinessadvantage.com. There's no one there. Don't write anything mean or nice. It's an autoresponder. It just gives you a link to all the research we just talked about here today, the 5 habits we talked about, a link to the free TED Talk, which is a 12-minute summary of this talk, so that if you wanted to do a positive habit with someone who wasn't here, or get them to share this idea with them, it's all free there. The links to the Oprah interview that we did, that was a whole hour on how do you restart happiness when it's hard, and then a link to the Harvard Business Review articles that have the research that we've been talking about. That's all there. It just spits out, or you can just skip all that and go to happinessadvantage.com. The reason I wanted to give you those resources is the next part is the challenging part. We have to move from information to transformation. We have to take this idea that happiness not only matters, but actually incorporate that enough to create a positive change within our life. But if we do that, we can tip this world away from negativity, stress, and uncertainty to a world that believes its behavior matters and sees the meaning involved within our life. I remember sitting on a floor at Harvard on the bathroom. Breathing was hard because of depression. And now I'm getting to be here with you here today talking about this work. And that's partly because people in my life surrounded me and helped care for me when I needed it. And now we can see that depression is not the end of the story. It's actually only the beginning. So first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for the work you're doing from somebody who desperately, desperately needed it. And thank you for having me here today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the time.